All right. My name is Thomas Bespoe. I'm the resident writing consultant here at the CBS Library. And my job is to help you get a handle on how to write a research project. This talk, of course, is part of a series of talks. And today we have arrived at how to write the discussion. Writing the discussion will be related to, it has a lot to do with a lot of the other sections. In past talks, I've always been talking about how does this section differentiate itself from other sections. That's going to be really, really important here as well. Not so much in terms of what the basis is, because as we'll see, the basis of the discussion is kind of ephemeral. It's your ability to think. So it's going to be much more about what the purpose of the discussion is. And it's really a question of what you've decided to do with your discussion, because there's lots of different choices when we get into this. There's a general strategy we use when we approach these kinds of problems. We don't like to start on a blank page. So we draw a line through the page, and then we try to give the problem a little bit of structure. And we've been saying, what is the basis on which any given section of your research project is written on? What is it that gives you the authority to write about this? What have you got in your luggage, as it were, that lets you say something interesting for this section? And then what are you on about, as they say? What is your purpose in writing this section? What is it you want to accomplish in exactly this section? Those two general questions are ones that you can use as guides for structuring your project. And you don't have to come up with exactly the same answers that I come up with. You don't have to. I'm not telling you the right way of doing this, but I am telling you ways that do work, right? These are ways that do help you get a handle on these kinds of problems. If we do look at our iceberg here, we'll see that if we're going to talk about the discussion section, as we will today, in a certain sense, I want to put kind of a double line under all the other sections that we're going to have the theory, the method, the analysis, and everything up here. So the first thing you want to really think about when you're thinking about the discussion in terms of its basis, its sourcing, is try not to introduce any new sources in the discussion. It's an interesting kind of bit of an obstruction or like a dogma rule, if to use Danish film language, right? That you give yourself some constraints. One of the constraints that you can give yourself for writing the discussion is not to use any sources that haven't already been mentioned somewhere else in the project, right? It's not a rule that you can always follow 100%, but there are really there's a really obvious one, right? Like your analysis is based on your data. So one of the things that is going to be above this double line is going to be your data. And you don't want to, when you're writing the discussion, introduce some new data point that you hadn't mentioned in the analysis, right? That's kind of cheating. Right? That makes it a little bit too easy to say something interesting in the discussion if you just didn't tell the reader something the analysis could have shown based on your data. Right? With the other things, it gets a little more interesting, right? So your methods is going to be based on experience. We'll also just label our sections here. So this was the analysis, and this was the methods. It's going to be based on your experience. In other words, what you did and why you did it to collect your data, right? That's really the basic structure of your method, is that you're describing the experiences you had deciding who to interview, how to design the interview guide, and so forth, right? So you're reporting on your experiences there. And one of the important parts of that experience is going to be the limitations that the way you collected your data provides you with in terms of doing your analysis, right? So you don't want to, in the discussion, and there is some discussion about this, I want to say. So some supervisors will say, oh, this is a perfect time in the discussion to introduce your limitations, right? To tell the reader what the limitations of your study are. But my kind of traditional view would be to say, keep the limitations as part of your method. So don't say in your discussion that, oh, by the way, there are certain things that we now have to tell you about how we collected our data, which actually limit the application of that data to the understanding of this, right? So try to, if you're going, that kind of thing should be mentioned in the methods, and we'll get back to discussing this actually. If you're going to discuss methodological limitations, which you can do, make sure that those limitations were already mentioned in the method section. Right? So don't introduce don't inform your reader of things that came up while you were doing your research after you've presented the data and the analysis. The theory is based on your literature, which you have reviewed in some kind of way probably. And again, when you get to the discussion and you're discussing things, what you don't want to do is introduce a new piece of literature that the reader could just have been introduced to already as part of your theory discussion. Right? You can identify some new aspect to it. You can draw it in. You can bring out new things in a source you've already cited. But the ideal would be that you've already mentioned it. You've already given the reader a chance to use their reading of that text to interpret your data and so forth, to follow your analysis. And of course, finally, there is the publicly available documentation that your background section has based itself on. And again, these are newspaper reports, various kinds, maybe company reports, OECD data, this sort of thing. So there's going to be background information that you've used to describe the empirical context that you've studied. You want to make sure that if that's going to be part of your discussion, the reader has already been informed about it in the background section, so that that information has already been made available to the reader. Right? And like I said, we've had talks on all of these sections past. So you can go in and look at those on the website. So in a certain sense, we want to leave the basis of the discussion blank. We want to say there's no new basis on which that gives you any kind of authority to write your discussion. But that's also why the real basis of the discussion is so important to emphasize, that you have the ability, you have the innate ability to think. Right? This is something that you were born with, and that is a thing to remember. It's a gift that you should use, always for good, of course. You should use it wisely. But more specifically, in your discipline, given your training and your education and all the thinking you've been doing on this particular project, you are better able to reason about the issues that you're studying, than most people, right? So give yourself that credit. It's also why it's a nice big chunk of the iceberg, right? It's something you've got under the surface, your capacity for thought about these issues, right? And it's something you want to make sure that your discussion section especially indicates, right? That you are able to reason about the consequences of your research, right? We'll get into the kinds of consequences you can talk about, but you really want to make sure that that's what you're drawing on. And that points up something else which is important, that this is not just you who are good at thinking, you are also granting the same capacity to your reader. So you and your reader are equally good at thinking about these things. And so that means that in a certain sense, the discussion section is, you could just not write it and give your reader a sufficient amount of time, and they could write it, right? Given all the information that you've provided the reader with in the rest of the project, the discussion follows by logic, right? The reader doesn't need to know anything that you know that you haven't already told them to write the discussion. The discussion actually follows logically from the premises that you've set up in the rest of the project. Now, of course, that's only true in principle, because in practice, you're going to choose the things that you think are important to talk about as things that follow from your research. And in that sense, the reader can't write exactly your discussion. But if you gave them enough sort of bullets to work through, they should be able to reason through it on the basis of their disciplinary knowledge, which they share with you, right? Good. So what is the purpose then of the discussion? The easiest way to think about this is to remind ourselves of the purpose of the analysis with respect to the theory. Somewhat controversially, I say that the purpose of the analysis is to bring about the artful disappointment of the reader's expectations of the object, and the expectations are the ones that you activated in the theory section, right? So you wrote your theory section to remind the reader of what sorts of things the reader expects of this kind of object that you've studied. And of course, you want to disappoint those expectations because you want to challenge the reader in some way. You want to set it up in such a way that, yeah, we know all of this from our reading, but when we actually go out and look at the empirical world, it is a bit more interesting, a bit more nuanced, there's more to it. And so we're going to have to let reality challenge us, right, a little bit. So this disappointment isn't meant in any literal sense. It's sort of just for fun disappointment. It's a disappointment that we want to have, because it really just means we're learning something above and beyond the theoretical reading we've done. So we're going beyond the literature in some way. But a disappointment has to have consequences, right? We have in the method section, we've built trust with the reader. So the reader trusts our data, which means that the reader will actually feel this disappointment, let it challenge them. And so we have to say, now what? What follows from this? How do we go on from here? And the purpose of the discussion, therefore, is to make explicit the implications of our research. That's a T, right? Also a T. So we've set up the reader's expectations, we've won their trust, we've then disappointed those expectations in the sense that we've challenged them in some way, right? And now the reader wants to know, where do we go from here? What are the implications of this? And we really have three ways forward. I usually say we have two main ways forward, but I have been reminded recently that there is actually an interesting third way that's also a possible, depending on how complex your projects are, that we need to take into account as well. The first one is the classic, I want to say the classic scientific set of implications. So these are implications for research, which means that they are going to feed back on the theory. We're going to call these theoretical implications. So there'll be theoretical implications of our work. And what we're really saying is, look, if we had certain expectations, if we had certain predictions that our model suggested would be natural in this kind of empirical context, and we did a study and the study showed us that something else is really true, then we have to go back to our theory and say, well, what is it in the theory that got this wrong? What concepts do we now have to adjust? Sometimes it's very minor adjustments. We just have to remember that there are some exceptions to the rules that the theory sets up, or that there are some particular conditions under which those concepts should be applied under particular circumstances, or in certain cases, we have to operationalize our categories a little bit differently, right? We have to, when we are building our observational constructs, we have to adjust them in light of the sorts of things that we discovered in our analysis. So sometimes it's just very minor little tweaks, right? These are just things to keep in mind going forward. And sometimes it's much more radical. It's like what Kuhn would call a scientific revolution, like a revolutionary crisis that you put the science in. So you've discovered something that the theory actually rules out. So the theory says this could never happen. And you've discovered that this does actually happen. And so maybe the theory now we have to ask, do we have to have a totally new theory? Right? It's unlikely to be the sort of thing that you discover, but that is technically, in principle, one of the possible things, one of the possible implications of your research, that you're going to turn the entire paradigm on its head. It's what's usually called a paradigm shift. Right? Now, the reason that that's an important thing to think about is that it helps you construct your literature review, which is also, in a sense, helps you construct your theory, and that helps you construct your reader. Because if you get a good sense of the 20 or 30 people that I mention as part of the literature that I've reviewed for this project, right? It's usually going to be a handful, like probably about 20 or 30 names that really play a major role in my theory. It doesn't necessarily have to be 20 or 30. It could be less than that, right? But the upper bound would be around 20 or 30. Those are the people who are currently representing the paradigm in which you're working. And if you were to discover something really, really major, something really revolutionary, then it's their minds that would have to change. And as Kuhn would put it, their change of mind is what we call a paradigm shift, right? It's not the entire world changing their mind. It's really just 20 or 30 researchers who now have to think very differently. That's a scientific paradigm shift, right? So it's nice to keep that in mind when you're doing your theorizing, is that when I get to my discussion and I don't call for a paradigm shift, right, I'm just calling for minor tweaks, what I'm doing is I'm engaging with the minds of these people who actually represent the paradigm, right? And that's how these theoretical discussions, so it can be from very small things to quite revolutionary things that our discussion is going to bring out. And that's, of course, a very normal way to approach the discussion section. Another way to do it, which is just as normal here at CBS, just as common, is to say, and I don't know if there's any economists in the room, maybe doing economics based. Normally make fun of them for this. They will say that they have this theory, this beautiful theory, perfect model of the markets. They will do an analysis of a market, price formation on a market, for example, and then they will determine that the prices aren't behaving as the model suggests they should, right? It almost prescribes how the prices should behave. And of course, they don't then suggest, oh, we got to fix the theory so it's better at predicting these prices. They say there's something wrong with the market, right? The market is inefficient. It's probably overregulated, right? So what are their implications? Their implications are that we have to change the law that governs this market. We have to change the rules because the rules are ruining the efficiency of the market. Like the rules are making the markets inefficient. So then what they do is they will say, we have to change the background conditions, the policy context, right? That actually explains why things are happening as they are, even though they shouldn't be in theory. In theory, they shouldn't be behaving this way. But in reality, they are. So let's go change reality, right? Let's not change our theory. I make fun of economists for thinking that way. They don't think it's funny. They think it's perfectly normal. And they are also not embarrassed by it because so many other disciplines do the same thing. So we have leadership theories, right, that know what good leadership is. They do an analysis of leadership in a particular organization, and they find the leader to be wanting in his charismaticness or whatever. And so what do they say? Do they say, oh, I guess we got to change our theories of leadership? No, they say we have to get rid of the leader and get a better one in there, right? That's I'm caricaturing, but it's something like that, right? The leader has to shape up. It's not our theories of leadership that are wrong. There are many, many theories like that within the social psychology of organizing and within management, even just ordinary management theories that work that way. But they have the right way of doing it, and the analysis shows that that the organization we're studying departs from it. We're going to call those practical implications, right? Again, there is a range of seriousness, if you will, or depth to that kind of discussion. And you really have to decide, where are we going to pitch this, right? Are we going to suggest a change of leadership? Are we going to suggest something more radical, like merging this organization with this other organization? That could be just a merging of teams, but it could also be, let's go buy this company, let's go buy the competition, right? Some of these decisions can be quite radical. It could be changing just a line in the tax code. That will fix the problem. It could be making a whole new law, right? Could be getting rid of the communist government or the socialist government, right? It could, of course, be the extreme one, which is our analysis shows that capitalism is broken, and we have to come up with a radical alternative before the planet explodes, right? That's pretty impractical, but yet, in principle, a practical implication, right? Because what it's suggesting is we have to go, as people, we have to go do something, right? As managers or citizens or whatever. It doesn't, like, you can pitch that any way you want. Now, in both of those cases, you really have to think about this. You get to the point where you're talking about the discussion, and part of the work of writing the discussion section is going to be to go back and kind of reverse engineer your theory section and your background section so that the reader has the information that the reader needs to understand the implications that you are going to emphasize, right? So if it's a change in the law that we're looking for, the background section should explain the current law, right? If it's a change in a set of concepts, the theory section should have explained those concepts in such a way that they're open to change, right? That they're the kind of things that we could have thought otherwise about, right? So you don't want to, and you certainly don't want to trap yourself in the situation where you, in the theory section, say these truths are self-evident and necessary and could not be otherwise. And then you get to the discussion section and say, oh, I guess we should think differently about this now, right? So you don't want to present things as completely incorrigible. And then when you get to the discussion section, that turns out to actually be the thing you want to fix. So make sure that whatever contingency, whatever space for change that you are going to be exploiting in the discussion was made available in the background section or the theory section, depending on whether your implications are going to be theoretical or practical. Students often ask me, can we do both? And I always say, well, yes, you can do anything you like. It's a free country. I recommend against it often, right? Doing both is doing it the hard way, because the danger of doing both is you're going to say the theory is right about some things, therefore the practice has to change. But you're also going to say the practice is right about some things, therefore the theory has to change. Right? It's kind of there's a give and take there. And if you're saying that both the theory has to change and the practice have to change, there is a suspicion in the reader that you're just kind of choosing aesthetically, right? It's just sort of what you prefer, right? You like this part of the practice, so we're going to keep that the same, and the theory has to change. You like this part of the theory, and so we're going to keep that the same. So you want to make sure that that suspicion doesn't arise. And there are ways of doing that. You can kind of present a pretty rigorous principled distinction between certain parts of the theory that should be sensitive to the change and certain parts of the practice that are more open to change. You might say the theory has to change on any point where changing the practice would be unethical. So you bring in like an ethical theory that says, well, we can't change this practice because that would be unethical. So the theory has to adjust to that. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and so what do you say, exploratory? Yeah, so you could have, and that sounds a little bit like we're getting back into the sort of philosophy of science stuff, right? Which, by the way, let me make an announcement. I will have a separate philosophy of science talk. I'm going to try to do that. I don't usually do it, but we'll try to do it because there's been lots of requests about that. But that's exactly right, actually. So if you have made very clear what kind of study this is, and in this kind of study, everything's fair game because it's exploratory, for example, right? then you've made your principled argument for doing theory and practice in your implications, right? But that's exactly the right point, is that you want to have some kind of argument, right? So we don't just get, oh, these are the things I think we should change in the theory. These are the things I think we should change in practice, right? There needs to be some, you need to acknowledge that that could just be because you have money invested in this and you don't have money invested in this, right? Good. And then I said there's a third one, which there is. Some studies arrive after they have analyzed the data, and they're getting to they're kind of trying to get over this disappointment of why things went awry. Why did the analysis show something that surprised us? They realize that actually this reveals not so much flaws in the theory, but maybe flaws in the method, right? So especially in projects that we do here, sort of year-end projects that have that sort of May deadline or whatever, you have to finish at some point. So if you discover flaws in your method too late in the game, you can't fix that by collecting new data and doing it again. But what you can do is say, well, you know what we've really learned here is not that we have to change the world, not that we have to change the theory, but that we need to be better at collecting data, right? So we're going to have methodological implications, right? What we're going to do is propose a different way of doing semi-structured interviews that doesn't run into these problems, right? We ran into some very specific problems. That's the reason that there's a tension between theory, or we suspect that's the reason that there is this tension between what the theory says and what we expect and what the analysis showed. So next time we're going to do the method better, right? Now, in all three cases, there is I can imagine there is a kind of humility that sets in when students approach this. They say, wait a minute, we're just students. Can we really suggest that we have to do methods different? Can we really suggest changes to the methods? Can we suggest changes to the dominant theory in the field? Right? Isn't there a lot of smart people who are smarter than us, more experienced than us, and have the authority to decide that? Do we have the authority to suggest that a company should do something differently, or that laws should be changed? Right? Are we actually in a position to do that? Do we have that kind of power? And the answer to that question is, in a certain sense, yeah, you're right. You need to be humble. But in another sense, you're kind of being too arrogant, because what you're assuming is that the method you described was the method being performed at its absolute top level, right? Like this is semi-structured interviews done exactly right. And then we ran into limitations. So we're going to suggest changes to interview methodology. Right? Or this is the theory in its most subtle, most nuanced, most precise form, right, that we have presented, and it ran into some limitations. So now we have to change the theory, right? And of course, that isn't what you did. You pitched the theory at whatever level you're working at. It could be a first-year project. It could be a bachelor project. Even if you're doing your master's thesis, you haven't got all the way yet, right? You're not at the top level of academic performance yet. So the only thing you're saying is that we did the best job that we could at our level. And after we had thought seriously about theory at this level, we expected certain things of the practice that we're looking at. And guess what? It still taught us something. We were able to learn from this empirical material, even after we had read all the books that we could find within reason and the time constraints and so forth, right? So we did a good theoretical, we did some good theoretical preparation. We got pretty far with that. Then we looked at the real world. It still taught us something. And you're showing your committee, your examiners, that you can actually learn from empirical experience, even though you've read a lot, right? So if you just kind of understand the humility of that situation, then you're perfectly fine talking about this as though you're recommending changes to the theory changes to the practice or changes to the reigning methodologies that are being used in the field, right? Because it is in a certain sense a school exercise, right? Now, at some point, somebody's going to say to you, and this does happen to master's projects, right? That you work with that humility, you confidently suggest changes to theory, thinking, of course, this is just for fun, this is just a student exercise. And then your supervisor says, whoa, wait a minute, you're onto something here, right? You really have noticed something that we haven't seen before, because you were, on this point, you were actually working at a very high level theoretically, and the data you gathered was actually of high quality, and we do actually have to take this seriously, right? That does happen as well. Right? But just don't think you have to know that in advance in order to take in this position of what are the implications. Concerns about that so far? I forgot to announce this at the beginning, but normally what we do is I just do what I say, this kind of thing. I talk for a little bit, then we turn off the recording equipment and take a little break. And then I'm here for as long as you have questions. But if you have something that should go on the tape, ask, go ahead.
For the analysis presentation and the discussions I put, this is what I take from what I just described to you really good. And then the implications are a separate chapter where I go, dear fellow scholars, this is what you should learn from this. Dear practitioners, this is what you should get from this. And then dear fellow students, this is what you can continue studying on.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just going to repeat it. This distinction between analysis and discussion especially is sort of rough compared to what some people would do. Some people would say, we're going to actually divide the analysis into findings and discussion of those findings. So we're going to present our findings. We're then going to discuss the significance of those findings. And then we're going to have an implication section. We're not going to call it discussion. We'll call that implications. We will divide that up into implications for scholarship and implications for practitioners. And we'll work through it in that way. And obviously, that's a much more detailed approach to it. What I would say, though, is the basic structure of trying to distinguish those parts where you are, because in that case, what you are saying is there's a section where you're discussing your findings and your basis of it is still referencing the data, right? You're still going to be pointing to the data in that discussion. And then there's going to be another part, which I would call discussion, but you're going to call implications, which is fine, where what you're now doing is saying, given that you've accepted our conclusions, so you've accepted our findings and our discussions of those findings, we're going to only think from here. We're going to proceed at the level of thought, and then we're going to identify these practical implications and theoretical implications, and perhaps even methodological implications. Oh, and I should add another classic methodological implication, which again maybe is most relevant for people doing their master's thesis, would be implications for suggestions for future study, right? So if you're going to go the PhD route, right, then this might be a place where you start imagining what the next level would be, right? And that's unvaried in ordinary journal articles. You find that often a lot, that a study will suggest certain things, discuss certain things, there'll be implications, and some of those implications are going to be, what studies do we now need to do to really test this, to really explore this new space that we've opened up with this study? So that's a very classic also implication. I would sort it under methodological in the sense that it's an implication just for research practice, right? We could also say we need another arrow, right? And another section. Let's have a look here. If you had done the thing that is sometimes recommended against and actually wrote a literature review, sometimes it's also required of you. So let's say you've written an actual literature review. Part of your discussion can be a so-called contribution to the literature, right? And that also will very much include these directions for new research, right? So this is real. We're showing we have this tradition, this literary tradition. Our study fits in like this, and that indicates that future studies should be doing this, right? Also certainly a possibility. But the question is a good one, and it's also one that really makes me want to emphasize two things. One of them is these are very, very general labels for different sections. You can come up with very different labels yourself. It doesn't have to be called discussion. It could be called implications, right? That's a great point. And even these bases and purposes are up for, as it were, discussion, but in another sense, are up for are decisions you get to make. The advice I have for you as your writing coach is just to be very clear with yourself, right, about what it is you're basing the different sections on, what your purpose is with them, and make sure that those decisions is what is helping you distinguish between them. So when you sit down to write those sections, you know what you're doing, you know where you are, right? You're not just putting words together, right? You are actually trying to achieve a very specific thing. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. And the other thing that the question is also really good occasion for me to say is, if there is even the slightest tension between what I say and what your supervisor says, right? Your supervisor is right. I am not right. The only thing that can happen is sometimes your supervisor will say something and the look on their face will be, maybe I shouldn't say this on the video. No, well, I'll say this on the video. The look on their face will tell you that they're not really committed to the, like, this is also just a suggestion they're making. And then you can actually say, well, wait a minute, I have an idea. And then you can basically give them my idea. And then the supervisor says, well, that's all right, that's good. Yeah, if you want to do it that way, and if that makes more sense to you, go ahead and do it that way, right? So it doesn't mean, I don't mean never argue with your supervisor. I'm just saying at the end of the day, the authority here is not me, right? I'm not giving you I'm not giving you an authoritative account of how to write research projects. I'm just giving you a way of thinking about the problem of writing a research project, right? That's an important thing to emphasize. Good. I hope I don't hear back from supervisors saying, what have you been telling us? All right, I will stop the recording, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then you can stay as long as you like, and I will answer any questions you have. And remember, you can ask questions about this session, but also about all the other sessions, past and future.